The office of Lancaster Innovations was cloaked in midnight silence, its glass walls reflecting the endless city lights like 1,000 eyes watching. Ethan Lancaster sat behind his desk, his tie loosened his expression, carved with fatigue but sharpened by the weight of power. He had summoned Grace Miller, a junior PR officer, under the pretense of reviewing documents, yet his tone carried the gravity of something deeper. Grace stood stiffly before him, clutching a folder close to her chest, trying to ignore the pulse that hammered in her ears. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "There is something I have been keeping from the board." He began, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. "This project, the one we are pushing toward IPO. It carries risks no one knows but me." Grace felt a chill crawl her spine. She had not expected confidence of this scale. She shifted slightly, and her eyes caught a faint, almost imperceptible red flicker behind the vase on the corner shelf. Her breath snagged. It was a recorder small and deliberate, its light blinking like the heartbeat of treachery. Someone had planted it here, and Ethan was about to speak his secrets straight into its waiting mouth. In one flash, Grace remembered what she had seen. Days ago, Isabel Lancaster, radiant wife of the CEO, in hushed conversation with CFO Raymond in the corridor, their bodies tilted too close, their words clipped as though carved in secrecy. She had dismissed it then, but now the image returned like a blade, and the blinking light confirmed what her gut had whispered. Ethan inhaled, his lips parting, ready to spill truths that could destroy him. "The patents," he said softly. "I am considering." Grace's panic overtook reason. If those words entered the recorder, Isabel and Raymond could twist them into evidence of misconduct, strip Ethan from his throne, perhaps worse. Without time to think, without permission, Grace surged forward, dropped the folder with a dull thud, and pressed her lips against his. The collision was startling, a shock of heat in the cold office air. Ethan stiffened his breath, stolen his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The silence rang loud, except for the muted sound of their lips meeting the machine. Behind the vase recording, nothing but the static of closeness. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Grace pulled away first, trembling, her cheeks aflame. Her voice was ragged, breaking under the weight of what she had just done. "Forgive me, please, but you cannot speak. There is a recorder. Someone is trying to trap you." Ethan rose sharply, his chair scraping the floor. His eyes, icy and disbelieving, followed where she pointed. He strode to the shelf, pulled the device free, and stared at the blinking light in his palm. Fury carved hard lines into his jaw. "Who dares?" He growled the words like steel. Grace's throat tightened, but she forced herself to answer. "I think it was Isabel, and she is not alone. I have seen her with Raymond. They meet in secret. They plan something against you." The names tasted bitter, even as she spoke them. Ethan staggered back a step, his chest heaving. His wife, his CFO, united in betrayal. Images of Isabel's gentle smile at the gala, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her lips whispering vows of loyalty, collided with the possibility that it had all been theater. Raymond, his trusted second-in-command, whose counsel had shaped so many financial strategies, now tangled in deceit. Grace's hands shook, but she held his gaze, refusing to retreat. "You were about to say something that would have ruined you," she whispered. "They wanted this. They wanted you to give them the rope to hang you with. Better they hear a foolish kiss than your confession." Ethan's stare bore into her furious, incredulous shaken. "Do you know what you have done, Grace? You crossed a line you cannot uncross." She lifted her chin, though tears burned her eyes. "Then let me be reckless. I would rather bear your anger than see you destroyed." The recorder sat lifeless now, on the desk mute witness to the moment. Ethan's silence stretched his mind, torn between outrage at her audacity and the gnawing realization that she might have saved him. His pride, his trust, his marriage, his company, all suddenly unstable. Grace stood before him, breath unsteady, waiting for his judgment. At last Ethan's voice came low and uneven, thick with suppressed emotion. "You had better be right, because if you are not, you have risked everything." Grace's reply was quiet but unwavering. "I am right, and this is only the beginning." Outside the city, lights glittered indifferently, unaware that inside Lancaster Innovations a war had begun. Ethan Lancaster had just learned that danger might live in his own home and within his boardroom. Grace Miller, the invisible employee, had kissed him not for desire, but to shield him from betrayal. Yet in that reckless act, something had shifted, and neither of them would ever return to the world as it had been. Ethan Lancaster's life had always been measured in decisions, not in dreams. Long before he became the young billionaire CEO, whose name appeared in every financial magazine, he was the boy who stood at the bedside of his dying mother, promising himself he would never again allow weakness to strip him of what he loved. His father, a man addicted to gambling, and vanity had squandered the family fortune, leaving Ethan and his mother in near ruin. It was only Ethan's relentless drive and raw intellect that pulled them through. By 26, he had founded Lancaster Innovations, a technology company that revolutionized data security. By 30, he was a billionaire, hailed as a genius of the digital age. Yet for all his brilliance, he carried scars that never healed, scars that made him cold, distrustful, and almost impossible to reach on a personal level. To the world, Ethan was untouchable. To himself, he was always standing on the edge of losing everything again. The public believed that Ethan finally softened when he married Isabel, a woman who seemed to embody grace and perfection. She was the darling of society pages, a philanthropist with a flawless smile, an elegance that dazzled everyone who looked at her. To Ethan, Isabel appeared like the partner he had long denied himself, someone who could stand beside him in the spotlight without flinching. Their wedding was a spectacle, covered in magazines, a symbol of stability. After years of Ethan being described as the city's most unapproachable bachelor, for a moment it almost seemed real, almost seemed like the fortress he had built. Around his heart had allowed one person in, but shadows rarely stay hidden forever, and the walls, Ethan thought, kept him safe, had cracks forming even before he realized it. Grace Miller entered his world not as a disruption, but as a footnote. She was 24, freshly graduated from university, on a scholarship that bore his company's name. Her father had once been a loyal engineer at Lancaster Innovations, a man whose brilliance in design contributed to the company's earliest prototypes. That man had died in a factory accident when Grace was still a teenager, leaving her mother ill and the family drowning in bills. Ethan had never met Grace then, but his foundation had funded her education, something she never forgot. She studied communication and public relations with fierce determination, working nights to support her mother. When she was offered a junior position at Lancaster Innovations, It felt like fate pulling her closer to the legacy her father had touched. To her colleagues, Grace was diligent but quiet someone who rarely spoke in meetings unless called upon. She carried herself with humility, careful not to draw attention in the tower filled with powerful voices. She often thought of herself as invisible as shadow in the halls of glass and steel, yet beneath her modest presence was a resolve carved by hardship. She admired Ethan from a distance, not for his wealth or aura, but because he embodied the kind of strength she wished she had when her father died. He was proof that ruin did not have to be the end. Ethan, on the other hand, barely registered Grace at first. To him, she was one of hundreds of employees, a name on payroll, a face among interns and assistants. He valued results, not personal stories. If Grace met his eyes in an elevator, he gave her a nod that was curt and polite, but nothing more. She accepted that because she did not work there to be noticed. She worked there because her father had given so much to the company, and she wanted to carry a piece of him forward. The company itself was entering its most dangerous era. Lancaster Innovations was preparing to go public, the IPO projected to raise billions, the stock market bracing for the surge. Investors circled like vultures, competitors tried to undermine confidence, and inside the boardroom, the pressure was suffocating. The IPO was Ethan's triumph, but also his greatest vulnerability. If anything tainted his reputation or suggested instability, the valuation could plummet and his enemies would feast. Grace knew little of the mechanics of finance, but she could feel the tension vibrating through every corridor of the tower. Executives spoke in clipped tones, employees whispered about sleepless nights, and Ethan himself moved like a storm contained in a suit relentless and intimidating. When he married Isabel just months before the IPO announcement, many assumed it was a sign of balance. A powerful man with a radiant wife seemed to project strength and certainty, the kind that reassured investors. But Grace noticed something unsettling. Isabel was beautiful, yes, but there was a hollowness in her smile, a calculation in her gestures. Grace told herself she was imagining things that cynicism came too easily to those who had lived through loss. Still, when she saw Isabel brushing a hand along CFO Raymond's arm in a hallway, the image burrowed deep in her mind. She did not want to believe it, then did not dare to. Grace's background and Ethan's background could not have been more different yet. They were linked by invisible threads. Both had been shaped by betrayal and loss. Both carried ghosts they never spoke of, and both stood inside a company that was now more than just a business. For Ethan, it was his empire, the shield he built against the world. For Grace, it was her father's legacy, the place where his sweat and blood still lived in blueprints and patents. Neither of them could afford to lose it. And yet forces were moving against them, forces hidden in familiar faces. The night Grace kissed Ethan in his office was the night those threads collided. She did not yet know that the secrets she carried would drag her into a battle for survival, nor that her admiration for Ethan would transform into something fiercer and more dangerous. Ethan did not yet know that the quiet employee who had once seemed invisible would become the only person he could trust when the walls of his life began to collapse. As Lancaster Innovations braced for its public debut, shadows grew darker around its CEO. Betrayal was coming not from distant competitors, but from the people closest to him. And in the middle of it all stood Grace, the girl who had entered his world, carrying nothing but her father's memory, and a loyalty no one had earned. The days following the discovery of the hidden recorder settled over Ethan Lancaster like a suffocating fog. He moved through meetings with his usual authority, his voice steady and commanding, but behind his steel gray eyes there was a storm that few could perceive. Grace Miller felt it in every encounter. He no longer dismissed her presence as easily. Instead, his gaze lingered sharp but searching, as if weighing whether she was ally or liability. Grace carried her secret with quiet dread. She knew Isabel and Raymond were dangerous, but she had no proof strong enough to confront Ethan directly. At least not beyond the recorder she had seen. Still, instinct urged her to watch more closely. It began with small details. Isabel's laughter carried a shade too sweet when she leaned toward Raymond during board lunches. Her perfectly manicured fingers lingered too long on his arm when she handed him documents. Once Grace passed by the executive suite and caught a flash of Isabel's hand brushing against his sleeve before they both stiffened, pretending nothing had happened. Grace tried to bury these images, but they accumulated like shards of glass, cutting each time she remembered. Ethan, for his part, began to feel Isabel's distance more keenly. She excused herself from dinners, claimed charity obligations, returned home late with explanations too smooth, too rehearsed. When he pressed her gently, she smiled with that luminous grace that the press adored, and said he was working too hard, that paranoia came from fatigue. And for a time, he almost believed her. But cracks widened when Grace stumbled across something tangible. She had been helping the communications department archive files when she noticed an email draft mistakenly stored in the wrong folder. It bore Ethan's digital signature, but she knew instantly it was forged. The proposal inside detailed a plan to liquidate several assets of Lancaster Innovations, selling at a price far below market value. Such a move would cripple the company's valuation before the IPO. Grace's hands trembled as she stared at the words. If this document reached the board under Ethan's name, his credibility would shatter. She printed a copy heart-pounding and carried it to him. When she entered his office, Ethan looked up, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. She laid the papers on his desk with trembling fingers. "Sir, I found this in the archives. It bears your name, but I do not believe it came from you." Ethan scanned the pages, his expression hardening, his voice cut like ice. "Where did you get this?" Grace's throat closed, fear gripping her. She explained quickly, describing the misfiled document. He stared at her, suspicion flaring. "Do you realize what you are implying? That someone inside this company, someone with access to my signature, is forging directives in my name. That is a criminal accusation." She nodded, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I know how it sounds, but I swear to you I only want to protect the company. My father died giving everything to this place. I will not let his work be sold off by people who only want to strip it bare." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, Ethan saw her not as a timid employee, but as a woman trembling between fear and courage. His anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. He leaned back, slowly searching her face. "You risked coming here with this, knowing I could fire you on the spot for insubordination." She whispered, "I would rather lose my job than watch this company be destroyed." For a long moment, silence stretched. Ethan's chest tightened. He thought of his mother's warnings about betrayal, of his father's lies, of the recorder Grace had revealed just nights ago. The possibility that Isabel and Raymond were behind this document slid into place like a cruel puzzle piece, yet he could not admit it aloud, not yet. Isabel herself entered the office later that day, her perfume preceding her, her smile radiant. Ethan held the forged document in his hand, watching her closely. She glanced at it, eyes widening just enough before she covered the reaction with a gentle laugh. "My love, you are drowning in paperwork again. You need rest, not more stress." Ethan studied her but said nothing. Isabel turned her attention to Grace, who lingered by the door. She reached out, touching Grace's arm lightly. "You should not burden Ethan with trivial mistakes, dear. He has enough on his plate." Grace forced a polite nod, but inside she burned. Isabel's voice dripped with charm, yet her eyes carried a glint of warning. Later, Grace overheard two assistants gossiping near the elevators. They said Isabel had been championing Grace's name in casual conversations, with the board praising her loyalty and hard work. To anyone else, it might sound generous, but Grace understood the tactic. Isabel was planting seeds shaping a narrative. If Ethan doubted Grace, Isabel could frame her as the overeager employee, meddling where she should not. Grace felt the net closing in, but she could not retreat. That night alone in the communications office, she sat staring at the city skyline, tears blurring the lights. She wanted to walk away to leave the company and the dangers it held. But then she remembered her father's calloused hands, guiding hers over blueprints, his voice telling her that the company was not just steel and glass, but legacy. She pressed her palms together and whispered, "I will not let them erase him." Meanwhile, Ethan wrestled with a growing unease. He had always prided himself on control, on knowing every angle before it struck. Now he felt blindsided, trapped between loyalty to his wife and the unsettling truths Grace kept presenting. He replayed her trembling words in his mind, her tears falling as she insisted she wanted nothing for herself. He did not know why it haunted him, but it did. In the quiet hours past midnight, Ethan found himself staring at the forged document again, his jaw clenched. He did not want to believe Isabel capable of such treachery. Yet the evidence was mounting, and the memory of the blinking recorder refused to fade. The first true signs of betrayal had surfaced, and for the first time, Ethan Lancaster felt the empire he had built shaking beneath his feet. Grace, once invisible, had forced him to look at the cracks. Whether he admitted it or not, he knew the storm had only just begun. The more Grace observed, the harder it became to ignore what her instincts screamed. Isabel's perfection was a mask, one that began to slip in fleeting moments when she thought no one was watching. Grace learned to notice the smallest details. Isabel often left the building late, but not alone. More than once, Grace spotted her slipping into the parking garage where Raymond waited with his sleek black car. Their meetings were brief, but intimate heads bent close voices, urgent movements careful. To the casual eye, it might have been business, but Grace saw the unmistakable electricity of collusion. She forced herself to stay in shadows, memorizing everything. Each new image added weight to the truth she had already uncovered. Isabel was not simply disloyal in marriage. She was conspiring with a man whose access to financial data could devastate Lancaster Innovations. Grace's chest ached with the knowledge, but she knew Ethan needed more than suspicion. He needed undeniable proof, One afternoon, while delivering revised press briefs to Isabel's personal assistant, Grace noticed a folder left open on Isabel's desk. Her heart pounded as she glimpsed the top page. It was a draft of a stock transfer agreement, a document outlining the sale of Ethan's shares to a private shell entity. No signatures were present, but the template was ready. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but Grace's hand reached out before she could stop herself. She slid one page from the folder and tucked it into her stack of papers, concealing it among her notes. By the time she returned to her desk, sweat dampened her back and her throat was dry. She stared at the document under the fluorescent lights of her cubicle, her heart racing. If Isabel completed this scheme, Ethan would not just lose face, he would lose control of his empire. That evening, Ethan called her into his office. His voice was clipped, his eyes weary. "You have been restless, Grace. What is it you think you are hiding from me?" She froze, panic coursing through her. Slowly, she produced the document, holding it out with trembling fingers. Ethan's gaze dropped to the page, then flicked back to her face. His eyes narrowed not with anger, but with something deeper, a searching intensity that unsettled her. "Where did you get this?" she stammered from Isabel's desk. "I should not have been near it, but I could not ignore what I saw." For a moment, Ethan's jaw tightened, suspicion hard in his expression. He stepped forward, taking the paper from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, sending a jolt neither expected. Grace looked up, their eyes locking. She whispered, "You do not see it, do you? They are trying to erase you. They want to strip you of everything." Ethan held her gaze longer than he should have. Something flickered in his chest, a crack in the armor he had worn since childhood. But just as quickly he pulled back, setting the document on his desk with deliberate calm. Outwardly, he dismissed it. Internally, he could no longer ignore the pattern. That night, Ethan sat alone with the lights dimmed, staring at the document Grace had risked her job to bring him. He wanted to call Isabel to confront her, but the memory of her perfect smile silenced him. He had lived through betrayal once as a child, when his father gambled away their security while assuring his mother everything was fine. The echoes of those lies haunted him still. Now they pressed closer than ever, embodied by the woman who had sworn vows before God and witnesses. Grace herself lingered in his thoughts. Her eyes when she pleaded, her hands shaking, but steady with determination, the way her voice cracked when she said she wanted nothing but to protect her father's legacy. Ethan told himself it was loyalty, not emotion, but the truth was messier. The following week brought more evidence. Grace noticed financial memos circulating with Raymond's authorization, but no record in the central system. She followed him one evening, careful and silent, trailing his car from the office to a private townhouse across the river. To her shock, Isabel answered the door. The two of them disappeared inside, and the blinds snapped shut. Grace stood frozen in the cold, the city lights flickering around her, knowing she could no longer deny what was happening. The next morning she approached Ethan again. He was seated at the long conference table reviewing contracts, his posture rigid. Grace placed a small folder in front of him, filled with her notes and the copied memo she had acquired. Ethan looked at her with a mixture of impatience and intrigue. "Grace, do you realize what risk you are taking? If you are wrong, this could ruin both of us." Her voice wavered, but her words were clear. "If I am wrong, then I will accept whatever punishment you give me. But if I am right, you cannot face this battle alone. Ethan studied her in silence. He saw the vulnerability in her stance, the courage it took to stand before him without title or shield. Against his will, he felt the weight of her presence grounding him. She was no longer invisible. She was a lifeline he had not asked for, but could not deny. As she turned to leave, his hand reached instinctively, brushing her wrist. The contact startled them both. For a heartbeat, they stood close, the world outside, muted, their breaths mingling. Ethan's voice dropped softer than he intended. If what you say is true, then I am surrounded by enemies. Grace's reply was a whisper. You are, but you are not alone. He let go of her hand, reluctantly retreating into his stoic mask. Yet inside something had shifted. The clues were no longer scattered shadows. They were solid pieces of betrayal, sharper each day. And with each revelation, Ethan realized he trusted Grace more than the woman he had married. Grace had grown accustomed to late nights in the tower, staying behind long after the corridors had emptied. It was during one of these evenings, while she was filing press updates on the 20th floor, that fate handed her the proof she dreaded. She had gone to the executive lounge to collect some forgotten drafts when voices drifted from the adjoining office. The door was ajar, just enough for sound to carry, and the unmistakable cadence of Isabel's voice floated through. Grace froze in place, her heart hammering. Isabel was speaking quickly, her words sharp with calculation rather than warmth. The IPO will be finalized in weeks, she said. Once he signs the agreement, we control the assets. Everything will pass through without suspicion. Grace pressed her back against the wall, holding her breath. Another voice answered, deeper, steady, the voice of Raymond. And you are certain he will not resist. Isabel gave a laugh, low and cold. Ethan is predictable when it comes to protecting his image. I will convince him it is routine. He will trust me before he trusts anyone else. He always has. Grace felt her stomach churn, bile rising as she listened. The betrayal was no longer subtle gestures or forged documents. This was confession, undeniable and raw. She shifted slightly, her hand brushing her phone in her pocket. With trembling fingers, she activated the recorder app and let it capture every word. Isabel continued her tone, dripping with contempt. Once the assets move, Ethan has no leverage. The board will follow the numbers, not loyalty. By then, Lancaster Innovations is ours, and the best part is he will never know until it is too late. Raymond's voice was smug. And what of her, the assistant who keeps sniffing around? Grace stiffened at the mention. Isabel's response cut like a blade. She is insignificant. If she interferes, we will discredit her. A whisper to the board, a rumor about her conduct, and she will be dismissed before she realizes it. Grace's knees nearly buckled. They were already planning her destruction alongside Ethan's. She held her phone tighter, praying the recording captured every syllable. When Isabel and Raymond finally ended their call and footsteps retreated down the hall, Grace darted into the empty lounge, collapsing into a chair. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. She played back the recording, relief flooding her as the voices echoed again. Proof. At last she had proof. But proof was only useful if Ethan believed it. That was the part she feared most. When she finally approached his office later that night, Ethan was standing on the balcony overlooking the city, his posture rigid against the skyline. He did not turn when she entered. "What is it this time, Grace?" he asked, his tone clipped. She swallowed her courage, wavering but holding. I overheard Isabel and Raymond. She was planning everything, the shares, the assets. I recorded it. His shoulders tensed, but he did not face her. Bring it here. She stepped forward and placed the phone on the desk, tapping play. The voices filled the office, clear, damning, impossible to deny. Ethan turned slowly. His face a mask of control, but his hand gripped the railing with such force his knuckles whitened. As Isabel's laugh spilled from the speakers, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard, with a fury she had never seen. The room seemed to shrink around them. Grace stood trembling, afraid he might explode, afraid he might break. When the recording ended, silence fell heavy. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, dangerous. If not for you, I would have signed away everything. His gaze locked on her, piercing. Why are you doing this, Grace? What do you want? She shook her head quickly. Eyes shining, I want nothing. I only want to protect this company. Protect you because my father gave his life to Lancaster Innovations. I cannot let them destroy what he believed in. Tears stung her eyes as she added, and because no one else seems willing to tell you the truth. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared at her. His fury softened into something else, something he could not name. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. If you had not brought this to me, I would already be finished. Grace, you may have saved everything. She blinked at the sound of her name on his lips, the warmth beneath the anger. Her breath caught her chest, tightening. For a second they stood on the edge of something neither could acknowledge. The night air cool around them, the city roaring below. Ethan looked away, breaking the spell. Keep this recording safe. No one can know until the moment is right. Grace nodded, clutching the phone as if it were her lifeline. As she left his office, her legs weak, she realized the war had shifted. She was no longer simply watching betrayal unfold. She was in the center of it, carrying the proof that could topple Isabel and Raymond. Proof that bound her fate to Ethan's in ways neither of them could undo. The following week unfolded like a storm contained inside glass walls. Ethan Lancaster carried himself through board meetings and investor calls with the same authority that had built his empire, but underneath the surface, every word Isabel had spoken on that recording gnawed at him. He studied her carefully at home, the way she touched his arm, the way she smiled, the way she spoke about charity events with practiced ease, and every detail felt poisoned. Yet he said nothing, not yet. He had learned long ago that survival depended on patience. At the office, his eyes found Grace Miller more often than he admitted. She no longer appeared to him as an invisible employee. She was the woman who had risked her career to reveal the truth, the one who had kissed him to stop his words from being trapped, the one who had given him proof when doubt had begun to erode his certainty. He asked her to stay late more frequently now, under the guise of preparing communication strategies for the IPO, but the real reason was trust. In the quiet hours past midnight, she sat across from him at the long conference table. Papers scattered, laptops glowing the city, stretching out beyond them. Sometimes she fell asleep, with her head resting on her folded arms, exhaustion claiming her after days of vigilance. Ethan found himself watching her, in those moments a strange tenderness tugging at him. Once he removed his jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders, his fingers brushing against her hair, before he pulled back sharply, reminding himself she was his employee, nothing more. Yet his heart refused to obey the boundaries his mind demanded. Grace, too, felt the shift. Ethan's presence, once intimidating, now felt like a fortress she was allowed to step inside. He listened when she spoke, even if only briefly, and in his silences, she sensed a man burdened not just by betrayal, but by loneliness. One night, while reviewing risk assessments, Ethan closed his laptop with a decisive snap and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "My mother was the kindest person I have ever known," he said suddenly, his voice low as if confessing to the night. Grace looked up, surprised by the intimacy of his tone. She waited without speaking. He continued, "My father betrayed her. He gambled away everything she saved, lied to her face, while she fought to keep our lives intact. I was 14 when I watched her cry in the kitchen, holding bills she could not pay. That was the day I promised myself I would never let anyone hold power over me again." Grace's chest tightened. She saw the boy he had been beneath the powerful man, the scar that shaped his armor. Quietly, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand, light but steady. "I understand," she whispered. "My father believed in this company until the day he died in that factory accident. I grew up watching my mother fight to keep us alive. That is why I cannot let Isabel and Raymond win. It is not only about you, it is about everything our fathers left behind." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat it felt as though the walls between them dissolved. Ethan did not pull away from her touch. Instead, he let her hand rest against his drawing strength from a connection he had not allowed in years. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You may be the only person I can trust." From that night forward, their alliance deepened. They devised a system of silent cooperation. Grace shadowed Isabel and Raymond, discreetly gathering fragments of suspicious behavior, while Ethan strategized ways to tighten internal controls without revealing his suspicions. More than once they met in hidden corners of the building, exchanging files and glances that lingered too long. Rumors began to stir among employees, whispers of the CEO and the PR officer working late together, but neither of them cared. They were fighting for survival, and survival required closeness. One evening, Grace arrived in the conference room with her hair damp from the rain, her clothes clinging slightly from the storm outside. She apologized for her appearance, embarrassed, but Ethan only shook his head. "You came here soaked, carrying files that could expose betrayal, and you still apologize. You are extraordinary." Grace's cheeks flushed warmth, blooming in her chest. For the first time, she saw in his eyes not just gratitude, but admiration. Later, when she grew weary from hours of cross-checking reports, Ethan guided her to the sofa near the window. "Rest a moment," he ordered softly. She obeyed, lying down reluctantly, her eyes fluttering closed. When she awoke minutes later, he was seated nearby, a glass of water in his hand, watching her as though guarding her dreams. The intimacy of that image seared into her memory. Ethan, too, felt the pull. He reminded himself that love was a weakness, that Isabel had already proven how dangerous vulnerability could be. Yet every time Grace stood before him, determined and fragile all at once, he felt something stirring that he could not suppress. Her loyalty was not the loyalty bought with vows or contracts. It was born of conviction, of shared scars of truth. It frightened him more than betrayal itself. Still, the more evidence they gathered, the more he realized she was right. Isabel and Raymond were orchestrating a quiet coup. Financial drafts, suspicious meetings, and now even subtle shifts in board sentiment pointed toward a conspiracy building in the shadows. Ethan might have dismissed it all had Grace not stood beside him, her resolve unshakable. Together they became a secret team, working in darkness against those closest to him. And in the process, the line between professional duty and personal bond blurred, until neither could deny it, though neither dared to name it aloud. In Ethan's eyes, Grace was no longer just an employee. She was the one who had stepped into his darkness and held out a light he found himself unwilling to let go. The deeper Ethan and Grace dug, the darker the schemes became. It started with an insurance file that Grace stumbled upon while combing through Isabel's personal drawer in the executive residence, a folder she should never have touched but could not ignore. Her breath caught when she saw Ethan's name listed as the insured and Isabel named as the sole beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar policy purchased only weeks earlier. The ink was barely dry. Grace's stomach twisted as the pieces connected. This was not just about financial manipulation or asset transfers. Isabel and Raymond were preparing for something irreversible. Grace carried the file to Ethan with trembling hands. He studied it in silence, his jaw tightening until the muscles in his face looked carved from stone. Finally, he said, "This is not coincidence." "Isabel never mentioned this to me." Grace's voice cracked. "It is more than a mission. She wants you gone." He slammed the folder shut, pacing the length of the office, fury radiating from him like fire barely contained. "I married a viper," he muttered under his breath. A viper who smiled at the altar. Grace wanted to comfort him, but fear overpowered the impulse. The next day, she intercepted an email sent from Isabel's encrypted account to Raymond. The subject line was innocuous, but the body of the message chilled her blood. Just one accident, it read. "The world will call it tragedy, and the company will be ours." Raymond's reply was attached equally cold. "I will be ready at the villa. The plan is simple. One misstep near the cliffs, and no one will question it." Grace's hands shook so violently, she almost dropped the printout. She rushed to Ethan, her voice breaking, as she told him what she had found. He read the message slowly, his face unreadable, and when he finished, he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "If this is true, then Isabel is not just betraying me. She is planning to kill me." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "We cannot ignore this. You must call the police." Ethan shook his head. "Without proof, without context, they will dismiss it. Isabel has cultivated her reputation too carefully. The press would call me paranoid, and the board would lose confidence. No, Grace, if we act too soon, they win." "Then what?" she whispered, terrified. "Do we wait until they push you off a cliff?" His expression softened for a rare moment as he touched her shoulder. "We wait, but not idly. We gather everything. If they try to make their move, we will be ready." That night, Grace could not sleep. She lay awake, replaying Isabel's voice in her mind. The cold laughter from the recording, the calculated cruelty of the email. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to protect herself. But another instinct held her firm. She could not abandon Ethan, not when his life was in danger. He had given her father's work meaning, and he had begun to show her a man beneath the armor, a man worth saving. Days later, Isabel suggested a weekend retreat at the coastal villa, presenting it as a chance for Ethan to rest before the IPO frenzy. She smiled sweetly as she told him, "We both need this, my love." Time to breathe away from the chaos. Ethan accepted, masking his suspicion, with a practiced smile. Grace overheard the invitation and felt her heart stop. She knew this was it. The plan was in motion. She wrestled with the choice of whether to confront Ethan directly, but in the end, she decided she could not let him go alone. She prepared quietly, arranging to travel nearby, under the pretense of handling press logistics for a potential charity partnership. Every step felt like walking into fire, but she reminded herself that fear was nothing compared to the thought of standing by while Ethan was murdered. On the night before the trip, she found herself in his office again. He looked up from his desk, his eyes dark. "You know, don't you?" he said quietly. "You know she means to try." Grace nodded, unable to speak. He stood walking closer, until they were only inches apart. For a moment the air between them vibrated with words unsaid. Then he whispered, "If I do not come back, you must take the recording and the emails to the authorities. Promise me." Her eyes blurred with tears as she shook her head. "Do not talk like that. You will come back. I will not let them take you." Ethan reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with surprising gentleness. "You already saved me once, Grace. Do not risk yourself again." But she knew she would. She had no choice. As the car carried Ethan and Isabel toward the coast the next morning, Grace followed at a careful distance, her hands gripping the wheel, her pulse hammering in her ears. The ocean loomed ahead, vast and merciless, and with it the cliffs where Isabel and Raymond intended to stage their accident. Grace whispered to herself over and over, "Not today, not him, not while I can fight." She was terrified, but she was ready. The villa stood at the edge of the sea, like a crown of glass and stone. Its terraces carved into the cliffs, overlooking waves that crashed far below. The air smelled of salt and danger, and Ethan Lancaster could feel the trap tightening, though he kept his expression calm. Isabel walked beside him, her hand hooked lightly into his arm. Her voice melodic as she spoke about sunsets and wine tastings, but every syllable tasted false. He could see the calculation in her eyes when she thought he was not looking. Grace was already near, hidden in plain sight, disguised as part of the staff, arranging flowers and checking the terrace lighting for a supposed weekend party. She had called a trusted contact at the local police, explaining the plot and begging for patience until she could deliver undeniable proof. They had agreed to wait positioning quietly nearby in case her signal came. Grace's heart hammered as she watched Isabel lead Ethan toward the cliffside terrace, her red dress flowing like a warning flag against the pale stone. From behind a column, Grace caught sight of Raymond lurking in the shadows, with his phone pressed to his ear, eyes locked on Ethan like a predator waiting for the moment to strike. She clenched her fists, praying Ethan sensed what she did. Isabel guided Ethan to the very edge, her voice dripping with sweetness. "You work too much, my love. Stand here with me, just breathe. The ocean is endless, and so is what we will build together." Ethan turned his face toward the horizon, but his jaw was tight. He answered softly, "And what exactly do you plan to build, Isabel?" She smiled, leaning closer, her lips brushing his ear. "A future free of burdens, just us." Behind them, Raymond shifted, ready to act. Grace could wait no longer. She stepped forward from the shadows and shouted Ethan. The sound cracked through the air like a shot. Ethan spun just as Raymond lunged his hands, shoving toward Ethan's back. But Grace's warning had come in time. Ethan twisted, breaking free from Isabel's grip, and Raymond stumbled against the stone wall. Chaos erupted. Ethan grabbed Raymond's arm, the two men struggling at the edge, their shoes scraping dangerously close to the drop. Isabel's mask shattered, her voice rising in fury. "Finish it, Raymond. Do it now." Grace rushed forward, fumbling in her pocket for the recorder she had kept hidden. She pressed it on, capturing every word as Isabel screamed. "Without him, Lancaster Innovations is ours. Do you hear me, ours?" The wind whipped her hair across her face, but her voice was clear, damning. Ethan shoved Raymond back with a surge of strength, his chest heaving as he faced Isabel. His eyes blazed with betrayal deeper than rage. So it was true, all of it. Isabel did not deny it. Her lips curled into a sneer, her beauty twisted by contempt. "Did you really believe I married you for love? You were a prize, Ethan, nothing more. A ticket into the empire your brilliance built. I was never going to share it with you." Raymond scrambled to his feet, his face pale but determined. "We should have done this sooner." He spat. Grace darted between them, her voice breaking as she cried out. "The police are outside. They heard everything." Isabel froze, her eyes widening, but before she could flee, sirens wailed faintly, in the distance growing louder by the second. Ethan stepped closer, his breath ragged, his fury contained only by sheer will. "You would have killed me," he said to Isabel, his voice low and shaking. "In my own home with my own partner." She met his eyes without shame. "If you were gone, everything would be mine. That was always the plan." Officers poured through the villa entrance moments later. Weapons raised, commands shouted. Raymond tried to run, but two men tackled him to the ground. Isabel was grabbed by the arm, still protesting, still insisting Ethan was lying. But the recorder in Grace's hand was already playing Isabel's voice, echoing through the terrace for every officer to hear. "Without him, Lancaster Innovations is ours." The words hung like a death knell. Isabel's protests turned to silence as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Raymond cursed, struggling, but the fight was over. The officers led them both away. Their plan collapsed into ruin. Ethan stood at the edge of the terrace, his chest rising and falling as if he had run a marathon. For the first time in his life, he looked shaken, beyond control. Grace approached cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached out. He turned to her, then his gray eyes stormy but alive, and without warning he pulled her into his arms. His voice was hoarse, breaking with relief and fury. "You saved me, Grace, again." She clung to him, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I could not let them hurt you. I could not." He drew back just enough to look at her, his hand brushing her cheek with unexpected tenderness. "You risked everything. Why?" She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "Because no one else would. Because you matter more than you realize." For a moment, they stood suspended between the ruin of betrayal and the fragile birth of something new. The terrace was littered with broken plans, the ocean roaring below. But in that instant, the world shrank to two people who had fought through lies and nearly lost everything. Ethan pressed his forehead against hers, his voice barely audible. "I do not know what I would have done without you." Grace's reply was soft trembling. "You will never have to find out." Officers re-entered, confirming the arrests and assuring Ethan the culprits would face charges. He nodded distantly, his focus still fixed on Grace. Around them, the villa echoed with the collapse of deceit, but within their embrace, a different truth emerged, unspoken yet undeniable. The arrest of Isabel Lancaster and CFO Raymond shook the city like a thunderclap. Within hours, headlines erupted across every major network painting the once perfect society couple in the harsh light of scandal. The world that had applauded their elegance now devoured the story of greed, betrayal, and attempted murder. For Ethan Lancaster, it was both vindication and devastation. He sat silently in the back of the car returning from the villa, his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on the blur of streetlights. Grace sat beside him, her recorder safely tucked away, her mind still reeling. Neither spoke, yet the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of survival. The following morning, the newspapers printed photos of Isabel in handcuffs, her designer dress wrinkled, her once flawless smile erased by fury. The captions were merciless: CEO's wife accused of plotting husband's murder, CFO and wife caught in billion-dollar conspiracy. Investors panicked briefly, but the release of the recording steadied the market. The evidence was undeniable, Isabel's own voice damning her in front of the world. Ethan attended the emergency board meeting in a tailored suit, his posture rigid, his face carved from stone. As the recording played in the conference room, directors exchanged horrified glances. When the last words echoed into silence, Ethan looked around the table and said in a voice that carried both authority and pain, "Lancaster Innovations will not be defined by betrayal. We will rise from this stronger, but we will do so with integrity." Grace sat at the edge of the room unnoticed by most, yet she felt his words resonate deep within her chest. He was not speaking only as a CEO. He was speaking as a man who had nearly been destroyed by the people closest to him, but who still refused to bow. The trial began weeks later, and the courtroom became a theater of drama that captivated the entire nation. Isabel entered in a sharp suit, her hair perfectly styled, her demeanor composed. She denied every accusation, insisting she was framed, painting herself as a victim of conspiracy. Raymond echoed her lies, claiming the recordings were fabricated, the documents forged. But the mountain of evidence Grace and Ethan had gathered crushed their defense piece by piece. The forged asset transfer, the insurance policy, the secret emails, and above all, the recording from the cliffside villa painted a picture too vivid to dismiss. Grace sat in the gallery each day, her heart pounding as she watched Ethan testify. He spoke calmly, recounting how he had discovered the recorder in his office, how Grace had warned him, how the plan had unfolded. His voice wavered only once when he said, "I believed I had found love, but instead I found betrayal." Grace's eyes blurred with tears as she listened, knowing how much it cost him to say those words publicly. When Isabel took the stand, her composure cracked. She lashed out, accusing Ethan of neglect, accusing Grace of seduction, twisting every truth into venom. But the jury was unmoved. The final blow came when the prosecution played the full recording of Isabel's confession on the cliff. Her own voice, dripping with greed and fury, sealed her fate. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the verdict. Guilty on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Raymond received the same. Isabel's face collapsed into rage and disbelief. As she was led away in shackles, her empire of lies finally shattered. Ethan sat rigid, his knuckles white, but when it was over, he exhaled a breath that seemed to release years of weight. Grace approached him in the corridor outside the courtroom, hesitant. He turned, meeting her eyes with a weariness she had never seen before. "It is done," he said softly. "Justice has spoken." She nodded, her throat too tight to answer. For the media, it was a sensation. For Ethan, it was an ending, but also a beginning. Lancaster Innovations stabilized the board, reaffirmed their loyalty, and investors returned with cautious confidence. Yet beneath the surface, Ethan was not the same man. He had lost a wife and a friend in one stroke, but he had also discovered a truth more powerful than betrayal. One evening after court, as the sun bled across the city skyline, Ethan walked beside Grace down a quiet corridor. His voice was low, vulnerable, in a way that startled her. "I thought I had lost everything, but instead I found someone who stood by me when no one else did." His eyes softened as they rested on her. "I found you." Grace's breath caught heat, rising to her cheeks. She wanted to reply, but words failed. Instead, she looked away, afraid he would see too much in her eyes. He did not press her, but his meaning lingered in the air between them, fragile and undeniable. In the weeks that followed, Ethan reclaimed his role not only as CEO, but as a man determined to rebuild with strength and clarity. He announced sweeping reforms, demanding transparency at every level of the company. He spoke of loyalty, of vigilance, of honor. The employees who had once whispered about his coldness now saw a leader tempered by fire, human yet unbreakable. And always Grace was near, quietly working her presence steady. Sometimes their eyes met across the conference table, and though no words passed, both felt the bond forged in betrayal and danger. One evening, after a long day of restructuring meetings, Ethan asked her to walk with him through the nearly empty halls. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly. He stopped near a window overlooking the city lights and turned to her. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I may have lost a wife, Grace, but I gained something I never expected. A person I can trust." Her heart swelled, tears threatening. She tried to speak, but he raised a hand gently. "Not now, not yet. But know this, you are not invisible to me anymore. You never were." In that moment, Grace realized that the justice they had fought for was not only about the law, it was about reclaiming truth, about tearing down illusions, about standing in the wreckage and choosing to believe again. Ethan Lancaster had been betrayed, but he was not broken. And Grace Miller, once the quiet employee, now stood at the center of his world, not because she sought it, but because she had earned it. The weeks after the trial passed in a blur of recovery for Lancaster Innovations. The company had faced scandal and nearly collapsed under betrayal. Yet out of the ashes came something stronger. Ethan Lancaster stood before the boardroom one morning, tall and composed, his gray eyes steady as he addressed the directors. Lancaster Innovations was never built by one person alone. He said, his voice resonant. It was built by loyalty, sacrifice, and truth. There is someone here who embodies that more than anyone I have ever known. He gestured toward the corner where Grace Miller sat, her notes clutched tightly in her hands, her cheeks flushed with confusion. "Grace Miller not only saved me," he continued, "but she saved this company. Without her courage, without her resolve, we would all be standing in ruins. From this day forward, she will serve as Chief Communications Officer." There was a murmur of surprise. Around the table, some whispers of disapproval. But Ethan's authority was unquestioned. He looked at Grace and gave a small nod, his expression unreadable to everyone but her. In that moment, she realized he was not only giving her a promotion, he was declaring to the world that she mattered. After the meeting, Grace retreated to her office, her heart still racing. She had never wanted recognition, only to protect her father's legacy and the man who had carried it forward. Now she sat at her desk, staring at the plaque with her new title, wondering if she belonged. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. Ethan entered without waiting for an answer, closing the door behind him. His presence filled the room, but his expression was softer than the one he showed to the board. "You look overwhelmed," he said. She laughed nervously. "That is one word for it. Why me, Ethan? There are so many people more qualified." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Because no one else risked everything for me. Because no one else saw through the lies. Because no one else kissed me to save my life." Her breath caught heat, rushing to her cheeks as the memory flooded back. That kiss had been reckless, desperate, and yet it had changed everything. Ethan's eyes softened further. "That first kiss was to stop me from speaking. It was survival. But now I want something different." Grace's heart pounded so loudly she thought he must hear it. She whispered different how. Ethan's hand brushed lightly against hers on the desk, his touch warm, deliberate. "Because now I want a kiss that is not about survival, not about betrayal, just about us." For a long moment they stood frozen, the air between them electric. Grace trembled, torn between fear of stepping into something dangerous and the undeniable pull of everything they had endured together. Slowly she lifted her eyes to his. He leaned in, closing the distance, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepened with a hunger held back too long. Grace melted into him, her hands clutching his shirt, as if anchoring herself to the moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his voice husky. This time no secrets, no lies, just us. Tears burned her eyes, but she smiled, whispering, "I can live with that." Outside the office windows, the city lights glowed endless and alive. For the first time in years, Ethan felt hope rather than suspicion when he looked toward the horizon. He had lost a wife, lost the illusion of love, but in its place, he had found something truer. Grace had not been chosen by convenience or appearances. She had chosen him when it mattered most, when the world conspired against him. Their story was no fairy tale, but something stronger forged in fire and darkness. That night they walked together through the nearly empty building. The echoes of their footsteps followed them down the polished corridors, reminders of the battles fought within these walls. Ethan paused near the main atrium, looking out at the city beyond. He spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. "I thought my strength came from building walls, from keeping everyone out. But it seems real strength comes from trusting the one person who breaks through." Grace squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "You do not have to be alone anymore." The words hung between them, fragile yet powerful. He turned to her, his eyes filled with something she had never seen in him before. Not just gratitude or admiration, but love raw and undeniable. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the truth of it. The world outside continued to turn. The company faced new challenges. The scars of betrayal remained, but none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was that Ethan Lancaster, the man who had vowed never to be vulnerable again, had found the one person who made vulnerability feel like salvation. And Grace Miller, the quiet employee who once believed she was invisible, now stood not only as his partner in business, but as the woman who held his heart. The story of betrayal had ended, but the story of love had only just begun. If this story touched your heart, if you felt every beat of Grace's fear and every flicker of Ethan's awakening love, then now is your moment to act. Do not just walk away from this screen as if nothing happened. Be part of the journey with us. Subscribe right now so you never miss the next story that might just change the way you see love, betrayal, and redemption. Imagine this tomorrow or next week, another story like this. Drops filled with twists you cannot predict, filled with characters you will cry for and root for, and you are the very first to hear it, the very first to feel it. That is what subscribing does for you, but subscribing alone is not enough. Hit the notification bell so that when the next tale of romance and resilience arrives, you are not left behind scrolling through a feed, but are right here at the moment of impact. And while you are here, leave us a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. We have readers from New York to California, from Houston to small towns across America, and even from countries far beyond. Join that chorus of voices, say hello, share your thoughts. Did you see Grace's courage coming? Did Ethan's final kiss give you chills? Was the betrayal too much to bear, or exactly the kind of drama that keeps you awake at night? Your voice matters, and when you share it, you make this community stronger. And after you comment, take one more step. Rate this story from 0 to 10. Be honest, be bold. Your ratings tell us what makes your heart race and what makes your tears fall, and we shape every next episode with that in mind. Do not underestimate how powerful your single comment can be. It is not just feedback, it is fuel. It is the spark that drives us to bring you bigger twists, deeper intimacy, and more unforgettable endings. If you loved Ethan and Grace tonight, then get ready, because the next story will not let you sleep easy. And finally, if you believe in what we are building here, if you want to keep this channel alive and growing, consider supporting us through the donation link in the description. Every dollar goes back into creating stories with more detail, more quality, more music, more editing, more life. You are not just a viewer, you are a co-creator. Together, we are not watching stories, we are writing them into the hearts of millions. So do not wait, do it now. Subscribe, hit the bell, comment your location, rate the story. Share this video with someone who loves drama and romance as much as you do. And if you can donate, this is not just a channel, this is a family. This is Emma's Stories, where every betrayal burns, every kiss lingers, and every ending opens a door to something greater. Stay with us. The next story might be the one that stays with you forever.